All right, so the problem of hell is one of the greatest stumbling blocks for Western people, and it has proven to be true for me as well. I struggle with hell. I struggle with the idea of hell, and for many people, I mean, hell is the deal breaker. It's like, imagine like you sit down with a friend for coffee who may or may not be a believer, and you talk about all the things we've talked about so far. You talk about the existence of God. You talk about the unlikelihood of the cosmos and the most minuscule to our DNA. You talk about evil and suffering and where the standard of morality comes from. And they may track with you all the way until you say, and then hell. And they're like, take it please, like get me away from this freak. Like when it comes to hell, Christians, not Christians, we all are like, ugh, this is just something that's icky and I don't want to talk about. It's why Peter Kreeft, he's a philosopher, professor at King's College, he said of all the doctrines of Christianity, hell is probably the most difficult to defend, the most burdensome to believe, and the first to be abandoned. And I agree. I do this for a living. Like I study the Bible and I try to find ways to communicate it. And hell was one of the very first things that I pushed back against. It's one of those things that I wanted to get rid of, and I still want to get rid of it. Because if I can get rid of the problem of hell, I can get rid of all of these questions as well. Like, how can an all-loving God who loves his creation judge people for eternity? Why does God condemn people eternally for something that they commit in such a finite amount of time? Like, why is it even necessary for hell to involve things that seem like torture, like things that have been stripped straight out of our horror movies around this time of the year? Like, why does hell, for eternity, have to exist in that state of eternal fires, of brimstone? And so as Christians, and as me, as I approach the topic of hell, these are the questions that I have. And these are the reasons, and maybe you have the same reasons, why it would be great to just explain away hell's existence altogether. Because not only do you get rid of these questions, but Christianity becomes a lot more welcoming if you don't have hell in the mix of it. Like, it's a lot easier to talk about. It's like all of a sudden Christianity is about love and grace and justice and healthy teachings and healthy lifestyles and pursuing the good life. And I never have to talk about that damned place where the damned go, using old language. So as I struggled with this, I ran across a quote, C.S. Lewis. You all know I love C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to talk about him a lot here. And I really resonated with the first part of this quote. He was correct when he said, there is no doctrine which I would be more willing to remove from Christianity than this one, if it were in my power. Like if it was in my power to eliminate hell, to erase it from God's plan, I would do it now. But I struggled with the second part of this quote. But, C.S. Lewis says, it has the full support of Scripture and specifically of our Lord's own words. It has always been held up by Christendom, and it has the support of reason. And that is my stumbling block. Because people in the Western world, in our context, we really like Jesus. And I really like Jesus. Like you hear people say, like I'm a red letter Christian, meaning I spend time with the words of Jesus and I can kind of leave the other things to the side. And we especially love Jesus when we compare him to the Old Testament God. Like that God who always seems angry, the God who's full of wrath, the God who always seems like he's punishing people. And people are always warmer to the New Testament Jesus because that Jesus seems like he's filled with love and grace and spiritual teachings for my life that are beneficial. The problem is that's only part of the truth. You see, the teachings of Jesus, or our understanding of hell, primarily comes from the teachings of Jesus, from the lips of Jesus himself. So if you were to take all of Jesus' teachings and break them into various subjects, 13% of his words and teachings, over half of his parables, are about hell, judgment, punishment, or the wrath of God. And so, if I want to get rid of hell, what I'm also implying is I want to get rid of the majority of Jesus' teachings in the process, and I'm not willing to do that. And so what I have to do is face this head on. I can't ignore it. I can't avoid it. I can't try to justify it. I have to understand what is actually happening here and what is the reason that its existence is important in the bigger picture. So it's one of the major obstacles I faced because I hate talking about hell. I hate the idea of it, but I can't escape. And what we can't escape is that the idea of hell is just as much as love and grace. It's just as much a New Testament, Jesus-centered teaching. So we have to face it head on. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to break down 4 of the major objections that I had with hell going into this study. They're formed in statements or just simple snippets, but these are my questions. These are my doubts. These are the reasons I want to get rid of it, and I still want to get rid of it. Like, you're not going to walk away from this likely fully convinced. I'm not. But I have to deal with the tension. I have to wrestle with it, and I have to seek what's most rational. And so I want to present what I found to you. One of them, the first one, is that hell is just repulsive. Like, if I would be lying to you if I told you I wasn't repulsed by the idea of it. But in order to keep myself from creating an echo chamber of my own desires, I have to face the question, why do I find the idea of hell so repulsive? Like, why is it so repulsive to me? Where do I get that idea from? So let's talk about ideas. Where do we get ideas about things? Like, any idea, any belief that we have over a certain issue, they are developed within our culture. The culture that we are raised in, the culture that we live in, the culture that we strive to be in, the culture that will be raised in our whole life with people who look and act and think just like we do. And within our cultures, we develop our ideas about the things that happen in our world and the things that exist. So let's just talk about my case. I am an educated, Western, postmodern, democratic, middle-class white male. I'm all of these things, right? So those things undoubtedly, right, influence my belief about hell. Like, my current context causes me to dislike hell. Like, it almost forces me to dislike it. Like, I'm repelled by the idea, but just because I am repelled by something does not provide me proof that it is not real or that it is not rational to make sense. It has no rationality to it. It just means I don't like it. And again, we're not opposed to our feelings, right? But we cannot allow our feelings and what we desire to dictate what is actually true, both in our life and in the world and for other people. Just because it doesn't feel good doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't feel good to fire people. And if you've ever had to do that, you know it's not a good feeling, but sometimes it's necessary and it needs to happen. And the flip side of the coin, it might feel good to sleep with any woman that I want, but it doesn't make it right and it doesn't make it true. So we cannot trust our feelings to dictate what is rational for us. So just the idea that hell is repulsive, just the fact that I don't like it, is not a good leg to stand on when it comes to its validity, its value, and its existence. So we have to move that to the side. But there's more, right? And we can dig a little bit deeper into it, right? Because hell, for many people, it seems unjust. Like, the punishment doesn't seem to match the crime. Like, how could a God judge for eternity what people did in such a finite amount of time? And this is when other theologies creep in. And so I'm going to introduce a theology, and it is a deep well that we're not going to get into. I'm just going to show you the face value. But what happens whenever you move away from hell and judgment, you really fall into 2 major categories. These are the extremes. One of them is that anybody that God doesn't like, he just gets rid of them. He doesn't judge them, he just eliminates them from existence. He just, poof, they're gone, doesn't matter anymore. They didn't receive judgment, they just no longer exist. This is a form of nihilism, right? There's no judgment involved, it's just getting rid of. The other side of the coin says, well, everybody just gets a get out of jail free card, right? Doesn't matter what you did, doesn't matter what you committed, doesn't matter the wrongs, right? You just are free to go. This is where the coexist stickers come into play. And this is called universalism. We actually have a universalist church just down the road here. And it's this idea, that all people, it doesn't matter where you are in life, if you have accepted Jesus or not, you fit under God's grace and you will be saved. The problem with those kinds of thinkings happen when you take just a small step out of our Western culture. Like if you just take a small step over the big puddle, right, and you step out of the Western context, you will find and learn that there are people who actually think the exact opposite of what we think when it comes to hell and God's judgment. Like they believe hell exists because God is a God of justice, not in spite of. So if you were raised in villages in Africa or the Middle East or India or China, you witnessed and you maybe have experienced your family, innocent men, women, children being kidnapped, being tortured, being raped, being sold off. You witnessed murder of the people that you loved. And whenever you witness something to that extremity, or you are a victim of that kind of horrific crime, like the questions of judgment and the question of punishment against the people who brought that pain on you, this isn't a philosophical consideration. This is a must for a God that you're going to follow. Miroslav Volf, he's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's written many books, really good books. He wrote a book called Allah, asking the questions, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God or different gods? But in one of his books, he addresses this. Miroslav Volf grew up in a village that experienced the desolation that we're talking about here. And reflecting on it, he says, it takes, listen to this quote, just let it sink in because it stunned me the first time that I read it. It takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of the thesis of God's refusal to judge. In a scorched land soaked in blood of the innocent, it will invariably die. That thesis will invariably die. And as one watched it die, one will do well to reflect about the many other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. Whenever you grow up in a world where everything's been ripped from you, this pleasant captivity that I can just get rid of God's judgment, or whatever other pleasant captivity that we hold in our mind because we live fairly comfortable lives, we begin releasing those whenever we witness something like scorched lands and dirt soaked in the blood of your family. So when we suggest that everybody gets to heaven because God is good, or that there is no real judgment for rapists and murderers and Hitlers and Stalins and people who do wrongdoings, right? The victims who do not live in the suburbs like we do, what they hear is a God who fails to uphold judgment. And they want to have nothing to do with that God. A God who doesn't stand up with the victim, a God who doesn't seek justice, who just lets it pass. And if we're honest, we know, as Christians, deep down, even if this is hard for us to face, we know a couple of things about God. One, that he exists. We know that he is perfectly good and just. We know that he judges impartially and fairly. He's not an earthly judge. Like he sees everything in its truest reality, crystal clear, full intentions. And so if all of those things are true, we must also understand that there are consequences for the evil that people bring into the world. And so maybe, just maybe, let me throw out a suggestion for you. Maybe, just maybe, our cultural moment right now, living in 2020, living in America, living in the comforts that we live in, and we live in comfort compared to the world. Living as middle-class folks, privileged middle-class folks. Maybe, just maybe, in our cultural moment is not a preeminent decipher of what is right and what is just for all of the cosmos. Maybe, just maybe, we don't have the clearest idea or picture of what is right and just. And it takes humility to admit that. It takes stepping away from myself of what I desire and what I want and what's comfortable for me to what might actually be true. And it's necessary for all of us to do that. Every moment. It's necessary for all of us to do that if we're ever going to step out of our echo chambers and hear ideas outside of those walls. So that is, hell is unjust. Let's talk about overkill. Like, okay, maybe it's just, but it seems a little extreme, right? I mean, a little over at the top. Like, one objection is that hell is actually a miscarriage of justice. It is justice, but it's a miscarriage of it. Like, a person sins for 80 years of their life, and then they get punished for eternity. Like, it doesn't seem to match up. Like, where is the justice in that? So first, we have to recognize the degree by which a person experiences punishment does not match the degree or the severity of the crime or the time it took them to commit that crime. Here's what I mean by that. It takes somebody 6 seconds to murder somebody else. Does that mean we are going to desire a 6-second punishment for that person? No. We don't base it off of the time it took to commit the crime or the time that they lived within that crime. We base the judgment off of the extremity of the crime. And we try to compare it to the value and the worth that was taken away because of that crime. And we demand punishments that accounts for what has been taken. Right? So we have to remove that from our argument. Right? The time comparison, it doesn't work when we're talking about crimes. Another problem with this way of objection is framed. We fail to rightly value the moral offenses of what we call sin. Like, we fail to truly recognize what sin is and the ripple effects that it has in our universe. Like, many times we tend to minimize our offenses. Like, thinking they're small, they're light. They certainly don't deserve the heavy burden of eternal punishment, right? And we certainly don't look at our own sin that same way. So we witness a man. Like, here's what I mean by we often will push these small things to the side. We don't see the ripple effects, like God's picture of sin. We see a man. He watches porn at night. He's married. He has a family. And we think, it's private. He's not hurting anybody. He watches porn, whatever. But that man begins to neglect his family, his kids. He begins, and it's just not enough. It's not fulfilling him. Eventually, he goes and commits adultery, sleeps with another woman, breaks that family apart. That family, the kids no longer have a father in the home. And the family, external family, they begin to be affected by it. And all of a sudden, we begin to see the ripple effect that one private sin had in a man's life and how it affected everybody around him. This is the problem with sin. As we think it's small, we can justify it. Surely it doesn't deserve, but we don't realize, and we can't realize the extremity of it and the ripple effect of it. Only God can understand the moral standards that he has set up and why he has set them up the way he has and why he judges against them the way he has. Like, in other words, we fundamentally, at our base core, we don't understand what sin is. And we don't understand the effects that it has on the universe. And so we don't know how to rightly judge against it. What seems small for us is huge for God. Plus, and this is the last one with hell being overkill, plus, when we are in the realm of sinning against God, we are on a far different level than sinning against our family members or our friends. Like, we believe God is an infinite being. He's perfectly beautiful. He has perfect value. He has perfect worth. And that means a sin against God is a sin that is infinite. It lives with him and it affects him infinitely. And so we're not just looking at the seriousness of the sin. We're not just looking at the seriousness of the sinner, but we're looking at the seriousness of the one who's being sinned against. And that means something to us. Like, imagine my 2 boys who are in there. One of them comes out and says, my brother is disrespecting me. He said something against me. He hit me, whatever. He's going to come out. We're going to say, you know what? You don't need to do that. Go stand in the corner, whatever. Sit back down. You're fine. You'll be okay. If one of them comes out and disrespects me and hits me, the punishment, right? The punishment's going to be far different. The same offense is made, but the person you are doing it against matters. And whenever we sin, whenever we hurt other human beings, whenever we hurt God's creation, we're not just sinning against other people. We're sinning against God, the Creator himself. And who we're sinning against matters. Is it overkill? Maybe for us, maybe for our limited view, but God has a far grander view of the order of the universe than we do. And we have to take that into consideration. Okay, the last one. Hell is a torture chamber, right? And we talked about overkill. This is it. Evangelical Christian turned atheist, Charles Templeton, he once said, I couldn't hold somebody's hand to a fire for a moment. Like, I couldn't even do that for an instant. How could a loving God, just because you don't obey him and do whatever he wants you to, how could that God torture you forever, not allowing you to die, but to continue in that pain for eternity? Like, there is not a criminal on the earth who would do such a thing. Okay, that's fair. This is the image that we have of hell. I typed in hell to Google, and this is what comes up. Like, this is our image of hell. This is what it looks like. The image of God holding bodies over flame, burning them forever. And it's an example of how easy it is for modern readers to misread the Bible and to not take into account cultural, historical, literary backgrounds that matter. For example, when Jesus says there's going to be fire, when he says there's going to be utter darkness, when he says there's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth, we have to understand that as a first century prophet, which is what Jesus is, he is using what is called apocalyptic language and imagery to make a theological point. Let Timothy Keller say it a different way. He says, all descriptions and depictions of heaven and of hell in the Bible, they are symbolic. They are metaphorical. Each metaphor suggests one aspect of the experience of hell. For example, fire tells us of disintegration, while darkness tells us of isolation. Having said that, does not at all imply that heaven and hell themselves are metaphors. They are very much realities, but all language about them is elusive and metaphorical and partial. The symbols and the languages used by Jesus and other New Testament authors describing hell, it is pointing us to something true and something real, but is served as a pointer, not a literal description of what it's going to be. There are attempts to use people and languages and things that we know to describe something that we can't understand. And we do this all the time with metaphor. He was running as fast as a cheetah. Well, was he running literally as fast as a cheetah? No, but in my moment, it really seemed like he was moving as fast as a cheetah. Like there wasn't a cheetah there to compare him to, but I'm trying to give you an idea to put you in the moment of what that was like. And that's what is happening here. Now, I am not suggesting that every time we run into a hard text, we can say, oh, it's just a symbol. It's just a symbol. We can push it off to the side. There's no real meaning to this, right? It's not going to be that bad. We can't damper the significance of what's happening here, but we can't take these languages and think that it's a movie showing us what's going to happen. It's literature. It's trying to help us understand something that we have not lived and experienced ourselves. So we use things that we've lived and experienced to try to understand things that we haven't lived and experienced. So like when Jesus, or in Revelation 5:6, Jesus is described as a lamb. I do not expect a woolly, four-legged Messiah with hooves to meet me when I get across the heavenly gates. But rather, the author is trying to help me understand Jesus' nature, right? We understand how metaphors work. Now, this is not a good time to say, oh, it's a symbol. Like, it's not going to be so bad, right? I want you to imagine a wet floor sign of a man slipping, right? A sign of what could happen, right? It's a symbol. You know that the experience of slipping yourself and hitting your head on the ground is a far more extreme and painful experience than seeing the symbol itself, right? You know the experience is painful. Just because the symbol might dampen the experience, it's pointing you to something that is extreme and is painful. Now, I'm not going to argue to know the exactness of hell. I'm not going to argue to know all of the details and what the experience is going to be like based off the symbols that we have. But what I will say, it's not somewhere you want to be, at least according to Jesus. It's not somewhere you want to be. So maybe I have, as a conclusion, maybe I have not answered your question of why hell is the way it is. Why does it have to be filled with anguish? Why does it have to be filled with pain? And the best way for me to understand that is to look at it from the other side. So here's what I mean. The reason I think anguish and pain exist in the place of hell is because if God is the life-giving source of everything in the universe, of everything good in existence. So think of everything good that you experience: joy, laughter, pleasure, water, sex, food, art, music. I mean, you can fill that list for yourself. Everything good that you experience, everything good that God gives us in what's called common grace. This is a grace given to everybody. Sinner or not sinner, we receive rain. We receive sunshine. It doesn't matter. We get to experience music and sex and food and drink. We get to experience all these things. It's a common grace given by God. It doesn't matter what you've done. What are we left with if God's presence, which all of these things come from, what are we left with if his presence is removed? What are you left with? That's what you have to think of. And it's our choice. Like we talked about this last week when we talked about free will, about God giving us the choice to choose him or not, to choose to have autonomy with God or away from God. Autonomy, like remove myself. Do I want to be removed from God or do I want to be with him? But what we'll quickly find in the scenario where we seek autonomy from God to push him away is that we're also seeking autonomy from everything that's good in our existence. Everything that's good in our experience. If we recognize them from God or not, everything that's good in existence flows from God. So what happens when you step away from it? See, what hell does, hell exposes the lie that we have told ourselves from the very beginning in the garden. It exposes the lie that we don't need God. It's a lie. C.S. Lewis captures it better, I think. He says, "There is no other way to the happiness for which we were made. Good things, as well as bad, are caught by a kind of infection. If you want to get warm, you have to stand near to the fire. If you want to be wet, you have to get into the water. If you want joy or power or peace or eternal life, you have to get close to or even into the thing that has them. They are not a sort of prize which God, even if he chose to, that he could just hand out to anybody. They are a great fountain of energy and beauty spurting up at the very center of reality. If you are close to it, the spray will wet you, and if you're not, you'll remain dry. Once a man is united to God, how could he not live forever? But once a man is separated from God, how could he not but wither and die?" You see, one day, God is going to bring about his ultimate judgment. I believe that. Hell or not, he is going to judge. And he's going to judge human beings not based off of one decision that they made in their life. And that's what we have to remember. When we think of justice today and we imagine the courtroom, we imagine somebody who's being persecuted off of the thing that they did. In fact, they have rules in the courtroom that say it doesn't matter all the good that he's done. It doesn't matter even all the bad that he's done. We're just looking at this one case, and he's going to be judged off of that. That's not how our good God is judging at the end of all times. No, he is judging by the thousands of choices that we have made in our lifetime. You are formed by the thousands of choices that you make every day. Like we choose to either value the things God values, or we choose not to. And those choices, their trajectory, they have ripple effects. They echo into all of eternity. Ending with C.S. Lewis, last quote. He famously says in an essay he has on hell, he says this: "There's two kinds of people, those who say thy will be done to God, or those to whom God in the end says thy will be done. Those in hell enjoy the horrible freedom for which they have demanded." You see, hell is real, at least I'm coming to believe. It definitely is scary. It's repulsive. I wish I could get rid of it. But in the end, there is a seriousness that can give way to the security if we can trust in the one who took on hell himself. Like whenever you're faced with hell, think about what you would rather. what you desire? Do you desire God to wipe the past sins of the damned at all costs, to wipe them away, to give people a fresh start, to give them another chance, smoothing every difficulty over, offering miraculous help? Is that what you desire from God? Well, guess what? Alas, that's exactly what he did in the person of Jesus. He's already done it. He's done the thing that we desire. And we have the choice. We can choose to accept it and lean into the thing that gives us every good thing that we experience, or he gives us the choice to push that reality to the side. God does that. He allows those people to be moved, knowing that they're going to be removed from everything that is good.